everyone. Welcome to today's broadcast. This webinar is being brought to you by the State-Federal RPS Collaborative. This project is managed by the Clean Energy States Alliance. And our topic today is solar industry trends. And to begin with, I'd just like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our participants today are in listen-only mode, which means that you can hear us, but we can't hear you. There's a few suggestions for audio on the screen. You can either listen in via your mic and speakers to avoid telephone charges, or you can use your telephone. Throughout the webinar, please submit your questions as you have them in the question box on your webinar console, and we will queue up your questions and answer them at the end of the webinar as time allows. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be made available on our website at cisa.org/webinars. And with that, I would like to introduce Warren Leon, CISA's Executive Director. Warren is going to introduce our guest speakers today and talk a little bit about the project. Warren, go ahead.
Hey, thank you very much, Samantha. Thanks all of you for joining us for what should be a good webinar on solar industry trends. Let me first point out that the Clean Energy States Alliance is a national nonprofit organization that works to implement clean energy policies, programs, and technology innovation at the state level. At the core of our organization is a national network of public agencies that are working to advance clean energy. If we go to the next slide, one of our projects is the State-Federal RPS Collaborative, which is an information sharing effort among state RPS administrators, federal agency representatives, and other stakeholders from across the country. We have a wide range of activities. You can sign up to get a free monthly newsletter where you find out what's going on with RPSs around the country. You could get announcements of other webinars and other events. In particular, in just a few short weeks, on the week of September 21st in Washington, D.C., we're having the National Summit on RPS. You can find out about that on our website. It's the first day of the summit is open to anyone. There's going to be some really interesting sessions, and you might want to check it out. But today we're talking about solar trends. And if we could go to the next slide, we're going to have two speakers today on this topic. Their organizations each produced a very interesting report that talks about solar trends, and each of them has a wide range of experience related to solar policy, solar technology, and they are both keen observers of what's gone on in the solar industry over the last couple of years and what's gone on in political activities related to solar over the last 2 decades, excuse me. And the way this is going to work is I'm going to introduce Larry Sherwood now. He will speak for about 20 minutes. I will then introduce Rob Sargent. He'll speak for about that much time as well, and then we'll have time for your questions. If you type in your questions, I'll keep track of them and ask them as we have time at the end of the two presentations. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first presenter, Larry Sherwood, who's Vice President and CEO of the Interstate Renewable Energy Council, or IREC. And he's worked with IREC in a range of different capacities for more than 10 years. He's author of the annual IREC report, author of the U.S. Solar Market Trends report, and he also edits the IREC Small Wind newsletter. He has more than 30 years experience in the renewable energy field, and when he's not working with IREC, he serves as president of Sherwood Associates, a renewable energy consulting firm. And he's going to talk about IREC's Solar Trends report. So, Larry, you're on.
Great, thank you very much. Let me just get okay. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. What I'm going to talk about over the next few minutes is the trends in solar installations over the last several years. We clearly have seen continued and sustained growth in this space. In 2013, the number of installations on a capacity factor was about 34% higher than what we saw in 2012. That actually was a slowing of the growth rate from what we had seen in previous years. The 10-year, year-over-year average growth rate is 55%. So quite robust growth, but still a little less than what we've seen before. One note about the presentation, when I'm talking about PV installations and capacity, I'm always talking in megawatts DC. You will see other reports that talk about megawatts AC, but these numbers are in DC. And the concentrating solar power information that I'll show, that does use AC information. One of the dramatic things that we've seen over the last several years is that solar and wind also are a really big percentage of the new electricity capacity that's being added in the United States. In 2013, solar was 31% of all new capacity additions. And of course, if you're going to get to a significant penetrations of solar in the overall marketplace, solar and wind are going to need to be big percentages of the new additions. In 2012, wind was the biggest source of new additions, and in 2014 so far, most of the new additions are either solar or wind. So that, I think, is a dramatic change from where we were 5 or more years ago, where solar was a tiny little blip of the new installations that were happening. A couple of the drivers for these installations, and I'll go through these quickly because I think Rob will talk about them, some of them at least, in more detail. But on the federal policy front, the federal investment tax credit, the 30% credit, that clearly is a really important driver for solar installations. And because that credit is coming to expiration in several years, we can expect to start to see some market disruption relative to that tax credit. Typically what happens when credits are expiring is you see a big spike in installations prior to the expiration date and then a drop-off of installations after the expiration date. And I'm sure that there will be conversation about potentially continuing that credit or perhaps changing it but continuing it in some fashion, but it seems extremely unlikely to me that that would happen by the expiration date. So I think we will see some of that disruption. The federal government is offering loan guarantees. Those have been especially important for the very large installations. The largest PV installations and the 3 concentrating solar power installations, all of those installations had federal loan guarantees for at least a portion of the installation cost. And then the Sunshot Initiative is really building infrastructure and building capacity in the long term to lower the cost of PV installations, and the federal government purchases solar for its own use for both military and non-military installations. On the state and utility policy front, net metering, renewable portfolio requirements, which of course the people on this call would be quite familiar with, and state and utility rebates are very important policy drivers. The rebates are generally decreasing in recent years and are really most important in states that have low electricity prices. In some states, the rebates have gone away, but the markets have remained strong. And then there are market factors. The cost of PV installations is definitely decreasing. Third-party ownership and financing, ways to make it easy for customers to deal with the high initial cost of a solar installation are really important. And we're seeing an increasing focus on quality of installations, largely because, I mean, for a variety of reasons, but especially because the financing people and insurance people are really keen on making sure that these installations are really going to perform as promised over the long period that they're providing financing. This chart just emphasizes the decrease in costs in the distributed sector. Also in the utility sector, you would see similar decrease. And these costs decreases are a really important factor that's been driving the growth of the PV market. So the time has really changed from 5 years ago. 5 years ago, most of the installations were non-residential distributed installations providing power on a customer site, and a small sliver of utility sector installations. Now we see most of the installations being utility sector, and the residential and non-residential being sort of equal pieces of the pie at smaller percentages. It's important to point out that all sectors have grown dramatically in the last 5 years. This just shows the relative proportion of installations in the different sectors. There were 84 installations in 2013 that were larger than 5 megawatts. This is just for PV. And those 84 installations had more capacity than the 154,000 installations that were smaller than 5 megawatts. So there are a small number of very big installations which really have a big impact on the overall capacity of PV that is being installed today. What I'm going to do now is go through the 3 different sectors and just give you a little bit of information about what the trends are and how things are developing in those sectors. And the first is the utility sector, which in my definition, this is power that's generated that is going in on the utility side of the meter into the wholesale market and is being distributed to the broader utility customer base. This picture here is the California Valley Solar Ranch. It's an almost 300 megawatt installation. This, although it's huge and you can just see the scale of it in this picture, it actually was only the 3rd largest PV installation that was completed in 2013. Of the 10 largest PV installations operating at the end of 2013, 8 of them were all or partially completed in 2013, and all 10 of those largest PV installations supply electricity for California customers. And the 7 largest all provide electricity for PG&E customers in California. This shows the growth in utility sector installed capacity growing from virtually nothing in terms of the installations 5 years ago, 6 years ago, to over 2.5 gigawatts installed in 2013 and a 48% increase in the capacity installed in 2013 compared to 2012. These installations are incredibly concentrated in just a few places, mostly in California, some in Arizona and North Carolina, and just a small number in other states. This is a chart of the installations for 2013. And in terms of how these deals are structured, most of them are third-party owned with utility power purchase agreements. So a third party owns the installation. They have a contract with the utility, usually a 20-year contract. But one thing to note is a lot of the owners of these third-party installations are, in fact, the non-regulated subsidiaries of utility companies. So utility companies may not be owning and generating the power in their own service territory, but many are owning these installations in other parts of the country. So in the utility sector, we also have concentrating solar power plants. This is the Solana plant in California, or in Arizona rather, 250 megawatts AC, and there was another parabolic trough, which is the technology used here, completed in California, 125 megawatts AC, and then there was this massive power tower complex in California, 3 power towers. The completion in 2013 was almost 400 megawatts, and this is the first commercial installation of the power tower technology in the United States. And here you can see the capacity installation. You can see that there have been very small to no installations for a number of years. These several installations that came online at the end of 2013, and there are some more in the pipeline. So we'll see some more concentrating solar installations as we move into the future. So moving to the distributed installations in the commercial area, non-residential installations, here we actually saw a small decrease in the number of installations in 2013 compared to 2012. There's a number of factors here. Part of it is a little bit of a hangover effect still from the elimination of the cash grant program, which allowed commercial owners of solar systems to receive a cash grant instead of the tax credit, and that really fueled and made a surge in installations in that sector before that cash grant program ended, and then, as is sort of typical when that kind of a program ends, it takes a little bit before the market sort of rebounds because there were people who sort of rushed to get their installations in before that deadline came along. Here you can see that there's a much wider distribution of where the non-residential installations are happening across the country, but we still do see just 6 states that are 75% of the market. So I think one takeaway that I think Rob will also talk about is that this is not a national market. There are a few states that have a lot of installations, and there clearly is a lot of potential in other states. And then the last sector is the residential sector, and this sector actually had the largest growth in 2013. It grew by 68% compared to installations in 2012. It's been a pretty steady, consistent performer over the years. good year-on-year growth, often not as spectacular as the other sectors, but definitely a steady, consistent performer. Here shows the residential installations by state, and the top markets, especially California and Hawaii, but to a lesser extent some of the other top markets, have really flipped from being markets that were driven by local incentives to now markets that are sustainable on their own without the state and local incentives. So the cost of the solar has come down, and the cost competes well with the local electricity prices. The last thing that I want to say about the distributed sector installations is, just as you see in this pie chart, most of those installations are net metered, and so net metering is an important policy and clearly is a policy that's very controversial and has a number of dockets and discussions happening in many states about the future of net metering. But if you look at the distributed sector and the way the installations have gone now, most of those installations have been net metered. So if that were to change, I think you need to look at what that would mean for those market segments. This chart just shows the cumulative total of all solar installations that have been made through all years. So we now have, and the yellow line is the total of all PV installations, and the red line adds in the concentrating solar power installations. So a little over 12 gigawatts of PV is installed in the United States, and we're getting close to 14 gigawatts, including the concentrating solar power. This is as of the end of 2013. The numbers that I've showed you here, as well as more information, is included in the IREC report on U.S. solar market trends. You can go to the publications page, and if you go to the trends area and scroll down and look for the report with this cover on it, and you can download that report. It is free, and I'm always happy to answer questions that people have about any of the details or the data that's included in that report. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation and pass the baton over to Rob, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have at the end of this webinar.
Hey, Larry, thank you very much. This is Warren, and that gave a good overview of the report, and in the question time we'll have an opportunity to get into a few more details as well. I'm going to introduce Rob, and we're going to switch to that presentation. But before I do that, I do want to respond to one question that came in, and that is to tell you that the slides from this presentation and the recording of the webinar will both be available online on our website, www.cisa.org. And let me introduce our second speaker, Rob Sargent. Now, Rob has more than 2 decades of experience leading a wide range of environmental and public interest campaigns. He's currently the Energy Program Director for Environment America, and in that role, he oversees policy and strategy development for energy and global warming campaigns throughout the country. He's been a policy advisor and a strategist in numerous successful campaigns to promote state renewable energy standards, other campaigns to promote the adoption of the California Clean Cars program in states across the country, for energy efficiency measures, and for other campaigns to get states and regions to commit to reducing global warming emissions. With that as an introduction, let me turn it over to Rob and remind everybody in the audience, if you have a question, type it in at any time, and I'll ask it at the end of Rob's presentation. So Rob, you're on.
Great, thanks, Warren and Larry. Honored to be following you. A lot of the good information we get about this stuff has come from you over the years. So we wanted to take just a little bit of a different tack on looking at the trends, and some of this will either reinforce or build on some of the points that Larry was making. But first and foremost, I think let's see, I'm trying to move the slide and it didn't move.
If you double click on your screen, I think that'll give you mouse control. There you go.
Very good. So first and foremost is one of the points that Larry made is I think people have had a general sense that there's a little bit more solar than there was a handful of years ago, but the trajectory that it's on is quite significant, and for folks like us that like solar, very encouraging. It's there's been on the order of 120-fold increase in 10 years, and I think more and more people are beginning to recognize the benefits and see solar as not only desirable but feasible, and we'd argue also necessary. There's a lot of reasons why I think, and some of these reasons why people are moving to solar, have been around for a long time. But I think people are finally waking up to it. Fundamentally, solar, the most appealing thing about solar is that it's a virtually unlimited resource with no fuel cost. So mostly when you're talking about solar, the biggest costs associated with it are the upfront costs, and anything you do to make it happen is an investment in access to an unlimited resource with no fuel costs. And related to that, I think people see it as quick to deploy. It's easier to site. There's certainly exceptions to prove that rule, but easier to site than other kinds of energy sources, and then has unique applications, particularly in urban areas and others, the ability to address a lot of issues and locate on existing structures. It lowers bills for customers. If done right, can save all ratepayers money by both reducing the cost of peak power, since solar operates in most parts of the country, operates best on days when there's the most strain on the grid. It can really have a salutary effect on the grid by reducing peak demand on hot sunny days, and also if done right can avoid the cost of transmission and distribution investments, and obviously with no fuel cost, it's a hedge against fuel price increases. And then certainly last but not, or among other reasons, is that it does create local jobs, and no matter where the solar panels are built, inherently most solar, particularly distributed solar, creates local jobs just by virtue of the fact that it's on or near site, and keeps more energy dollars in the local economy. And then obviously Environment America is a big booster of solar for the last reason, which that it generates much less pollution, and has the potential as it grows to be a central part of any strategy to meet our energy needs while emitting less pollution. So what we did, just to take a look at this and to look at the trend, and again, you saw some of the charts in Larry's presentation, but we decided we'd take a look at the top 10 states, and to be fair, looked at them, ranked them 1 through 10 on the per capita installed solar, so as to be fair to the little states, and wanted to take a look at what they had in common. These are the 10 states here, and the first two, the first column lists them in order, or actually the third column lists their rank on per capita solar. And a couple things we found about it, and again, this one is, a small number of states are responsible for a large amount of the solar. Again, not a surprise, and Larry alluded to that. But just to put it into perspective, 87% of the solar was installed in states that represent 20% of the electricity sales and 26% of the population. And that number was even slightly higher when you look at the amount of solar electricity installed last year. We just did kind of a little heat map here to show the density of solar. And obviously you can see in some of the southwest states that there's, the states you'd expect to have a lot of solar, have it, but there's some pretty dark patches spread out throughout the country, and including New Jersey and some of the New England states and North Carolina. And then this is just, some of you have probably seen this chart. I think it's worth reinforcing that, solar energy is, not just for sunny states, and this map is a good illustration of it. Germany, which is widely acknowledged to have, to be the world solar leader, has, about the same solar potential as Alaska, and this is and you can see Spain has roughly the same solar capacity as much of the Mid-Atlantic and Midwest. So what do the leading solar states have in common? What we found was they have a can-do attitude about solar. They recognize the many benefits that we mentioned, and they have put policies in place to back up their can-do attitude about solar, recognizing that anything you do on solar is is an investment in access to a pollution-free resource that has no fuel costs. And so as people are thinking about meeting environmental objectives, reducing carbon emissions, whatever the case may be, and expanding their options and moving into more of a 21st century energy system, solar has great appeal. So what we saw was that among the top 10 states, 9 have strong net metering policies, and in nearly all of the leading states, their folks are compensated at the full retail rate for the excess electricity they supply to the grid. 9 have strong statewide interconnection policies. All of them have renewable energy standards, and 8 of the 10 have explicit solar or distributed generation so-called carve-outs that recognize the unique benefits of distributed generation and have public policy to encourage that. And 9 of them have a variety of creative financing options, including the ability for folks other than utilities to sell solar, and in some states, also many of the states also have begun experimenting with and succeeding in some states in property assessed clean energy financing. We can get into some issues around that came up with residential financing having to do with decisions that were made by the federal housing regulator, mortgage regulators. But what they had in common was a set of strong policies. And the report has more details and looks at every single one of the states. So the top 10 states, I think, are worth noting. For those that are just below that top tier, I think it's worth acknowledging that there are a number of states that are that are beginning to surge. This reflects policies that have been in place over time. A number of states have begun putting policies in place as they see how it's working in other states. That's what we hope will continue to happen. So, for example, New York State didn't make the cut on the top 10 per capita, but does rank net 9th in the nation for cumulative solar capacity, and has just recently dramatically expanded its commitment to solar energy through its Solar Sun initiative and other incentives that it's put in place. Vermont has as well, and perhaps most noteworthy is Georgia, which really surged last year, grew solar grew more than threefold in Georgia last year because of actions taken by their regulators to procure 525 megawatts of solar by the end of 2016. I think that's one other thing. And then there's a number of states. Texas would be a state where there's quite a bit of solar. It ranks quite high in terms of cumulative solar. Virtually, or the vast majority of the solar that's happening in Texas has less to do with state policy and more to do with the fact that two of their municipally owned utilities have made a commitment to solar in Austin and San Antonio. Trying to move my slide here. So I think we can leave it at that, because I think much of what I'd want to say will come out in questions. I guess the main point we'd want to make is that there's a lot to learn. The growth of solar is, as Larry alluded to, prompting some big questions about what's the value of solar. I think that there's a lot of sort of advanced thinking that needs to go on about a new way of doing things that focuses more on distributed generation, and a lot of education that needs to happen about the value that solar provides to the grid in terms of, as I said, avoiding peak demand, the avoided cost of transmission and distribution. So it hasn't succeeded in the past, I think, and been a niche energy option because people haven't been thinking as holistically about the grid. And I think that those conversations are now happening, and I think that like telecommunications, like most technologies, solar is advancing much faster than goals that somebody might have set a handful of years ago are now being surpassed. There are, recent projections. There's already more solar now in this country than recent projections said we would have in 2020. So it's moving fast. It's a huge opportunity. We need to seize it, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Hey, thanks very much, Rob. And I do have some questions to ask both of you, but I need to tell folks on the line that although I have some questions in the queue. There is room for more questions if you want to type them in. The first question is for Larry, and somebody was asking, in the IREC report, is there any information on solar prices?
So you mean the cost of installation?
Yeah.
We have a small amount of information, but that is not a big focus of the IREC report. I think the best report to show cost trends for PV installations and the different of costs for different sizes, different states, is a report by Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and I believe the title is Tracking the Sun. And they've done it annually for a number of years, and the current year report is due to come out sometime soon.
Good, thank you. And I have a question for Rob. I won't say which state this came from, but I bet you'll guess it did not come from Texas or California or Alaska. And this person asks, in addition to ranking the states per capita, how about ranking them per square mile? Did you think of doing that?
We did not. We could. It wouldn't be hard.
So we'll take that in as a suggestion then. And here's a question for both of you. Both of your presentations underline the importance of net metering. Yet, as you know, there are a lot of proposed changes out there to the electricity tariff structure, and in some states there's an effort to shift to a more fixed cost tariff. Do either of you have any comments as to whether solar can continue to be expanding and continue to prosper if we, in some states, move away from net metering and move towards some other structure for determining the value of solar?
Well, I would just start by saying there's no question that net metering has, combined probably with the federal tax credit, is the single biggest factor in the growth of at least residential and small commercial solar, and so it's I think critical that we stay the course on that in the short term. I also think that it's extremely premature to be eliminating or modifying net metering until we've done a full-on accounting of the value that the solar that's being sold back to the grid provides to the grid itself and to other ratepayers. And I think that people are beginning to figure out ways to do that, but I think you can't have a conversation about cost shifting and other things without a serious and honest analysis of that.
And Larry, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just agree that that I think the properly valuing the solar contribution to the grid is important. IREC has published a report for regulators to help them determine which factors and suggest factors that they should include in that valuation analysis. I think the range of options that people are talking about is all over the board, and the devil is going to be in the details of how things get implemented in different states. And so I think the impact on the markets will vary from state to state, and can be a big impact to a small impact. And I guess I would just sort of mention that things that some commentators see coming in the future, which is that if solar prices continue to fall, and especially if storage becomes more viable and the storage prices continue to fall, if the obstacles for people connecting solar start to become too big, they may have the option of just disconnecting themselves from the grid and doing solar and storage, and I think that's not in the interest of the utility companies to encourage that. So I think there's a lot of different scenarios, and I think it's going to be a really active debate and a really active market that we're going to see things develop that we might not expect.
Good. I have a couple very specific questions for you, Larry. The first one is, does the 31% number in the report, for where you say 31% of all U.S. electricity power installed and 13 was solar, does that include commercial and residential? That's everything, right?
Yes. So the way I came up with that number is I used the data that's published by the Energy Information Agency on additions to the utility grid. Their information for solar just includes utility sector solar installations, so I took that number and I added the distributed solar to the total to come up with that total number.
Good. And I have sort of several related questions here having to do with the numbers you have, Larry, and the efficiency of solar panels.
Okay.
And I'll throw them all out and you could comment on it. Given that the capacity factor of solar compared to some other technologies is lower, does a number that just looks at capacity give a unfair picture of how much solar is really adding to our electricity generation in the country? The second is the efficiency of solar panels on the increase, and if that's the case, aren't your numbers even more impressive in some ways when you look at the trend in capacity? Because if the newer installations have a higher capacity factor, they're actually generating more per kilowatt than installations installed 10 years ago.
So it's absolutely correct that in some ways that capacity pie chart that I had is an apples to oranges comparison, because the amount of energy produced by those different sources is different. Clearly, the amount produced per year from a megawatt of solar would be different than a megawatt of wind. And for natural gas, some of the plants that are put in are designed just as peaking plants and don't operate very often, and others are more baseload plants that operate a lot of the time. So there is a wide variation. I think the message from that just is that solar is noticeable now, whereas it was a blip that you wouldn't even notice on a chart like that 5 years ago. So I think the relative magnitude is important, but it's true that you can't directly compare. And on the other point, it is definitely true that the efficiency of solar panels are increasing, and it's also true that many of especially the larger solar PV installations, the utility scale installations, use trackers, and so their amount of kilowatt hours produced per kilowatt of installation is higher than a fixed rooftop installation might be. So all of those factors, the capacity is sort of an easy metric to show, but it is true that at the end of the day, what you're looking at are kilowatt hours that are produced, useful energy that's that consumers are taking advantage of.
Well, let me ask you both some questions that ask you to look into your crystal ball here, and I'll throw out several questions that have come in that are related to this. One is just, what do you think this year will end up looking like in comparison to last year? So if you folks are writing these reports a year from now, do you have a sense of what they'll look like? And secondly, do you think PV will be dominated by utility scale PV in the future, or we'll see a similar mix to what we've had the past several years? And then finally, whether you could hypothesize what might happen to the relative market share of the three market segments, both in advance of and after changes to the federal tax credits. You could pick on any of those questions, but basically they all ask you to think about the future.
Well, I'll take the first question, which is if we don't blow it, and people take the lessons and learn from the experience of the people, both private sector, individuals, companies that are utilizing solar, and the state and local governments who are advancing solar, I think we'll continue to see steady growth. And even though solar represents only less than 1% of the generation in this country, that we are on a trajectory for it to be, it only has to grow even by a less than the rate at which it's been growing over the last handful of years for it to be a major contribute, 20-30% of our, the power we get. And I think you'll see even more and more of that game changing going on, the same way we saw, flat screen TVs that cost $5,000 10 years ago now cost $200 and are in, my kids don't even know what a cathode ray tube is. So, there's those kind of advances that are happening that go way beyond what anybody would have imagined. So I think that that's wholly realistic, and I think unless people actually try to stop it or succeed in stopping it affirmatively, that's the trajectory we can be on.
Larry, do you want to respond to any of those questions?
Yes. So I would say that on the utility sector installations, a lot of those installations that are happening now are driven by RPS policies in different states. So I think the question is, what happens as the RPS quotas are filled, and what happens moving toward the future? And I think there is a smaller number of those utility sector projects in the pipeline now than there were a year ago. So I think that is a question. One positive thing that we've seen from the solar market perspective is that there was a project that was announced recently in Colorado, which is not based on a large solar project, I think like 170 megawatts or something. It was not based on the RPS requirement. It was totally based just on the economics and the advantage to the utility of the installation. And so if that starts happening more broadly, and that's really what's happened in California and Hawaii on the residential sector installations, is that they're just very advantageous to do for local customers, then I think those markets will continue to grow. I think the 30% credit and what happens when that goes away, you know, it's hard to imagine that there won't be any impact on the market. I think the savvy industry players are clearly sharpening their pencils and figuring out how to continue to sell product and make installations happen if that tax credit were to go away, but it would likely result in winners and losers. Some installations that are happening now wouldn't be feasible anymore. Others might still make a lot of sense. So it's, but I think it's inevitable that there'll be some disruption in the marketplace when that happens.
And in terms of disruptions in the marketplace, how about whether you've seen already or think you'll likely see effects of changes to Chinese PV component prices, and also the risk of Chinese components rising sharply due to tariffs and the ongoing trade dispute?
Well, I would just say one thing on one trend that I think we'll see is that as the demand grows for solar domestically, that we'll start seeing more manufacturing being sited locally. Perhaps some for the reasons you mentioned, but also just because solar panels are pretty fragile and heavy, and you know, making them closer to where you need them, you know, makes a lot of sense.
I think for a variety of reasons, including the Chinese tariff situation, but for other sort of bigger market reasons, I think the decrease in the cost of modules is going to moderate, or they may level out. So we may not see the large decrease in module prices going forward that we have seen over the last 5 years. I think there likely would continue to be some decrease in the prices of the soft costs, the permitting costs, financing costs, those types of things, as well as some of the other balance of component and installation costs relative to systems. But it wouldn't surprise me if the cost drops are not as dramatic as what we've been seeing.
That's right.
I think what I'm going to do is ask you one more specific question, and then after that give you each a minute or two to say anything else you want to say that you haven't had a chance to say. But the one other specific question that came in a while back, which I found as interesting one, whether you see the drought in the West as potentially being a significant driver of increased solar energy adoption. Have you seen any discussion of that?
Yeah, I think increasingly, you know, wind and certainly PV, you know, don't require the volumes of water that any kind of steam turbine generating technology requires, and so that just you know, that's just one more thing that people need to be thinking about as they're thinking about the, you know, the upsides of moving to doing more of it.
And I think that concentrating solar power is a solar technology that does, in many cases, use some water, and there definitely has been movement towards technologies that use less water, and that definitely is an issue for that particular technology moving forward.
Right.
Good. Well, let me give each of you a minute or two to say anything you haven't had a chance to say up till now that you would like to leave our attendees with. Rob, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think the big, and maybe I'm just repeating some things I've said before, but I think I think it's important for people to take a look at, you know, what's actually happening with solar today, how it's being applied, and how it's benefiting communities and businesses and customers. And I think way too often the solar is both the technology and the solar technology and the thinking, more holistic thinking about the grid is evolving so quickly that often the debate about solar falls prey to you know, sort of a static analysis of where it was a few years ago, whether it's on cost or on feasibility, and I would urge everybody to be thinking 2 years out on solar, not 2 years behind, because I think that will be the more relevant numbers and assumptions to be looking at in most cases.
Good. Well, thank you. And Larry, you get the last word.
Okay. I'll make two comments. One is, I think for the places that have really large amounts of solar installations like California and Hawaii, I think the future is really looking at how to accommodate really high volumes of solar on those grids and make those grids more reliable in the process. And that will involve both work on the inverters and how they connect to the grid, as well as the grid engineering itself. And then secondly, I think that the overall trends and how concentrated the solar installations are in a few places mean that there are huge opportunities for solar in many, many parts of the country. And on just sheer volume, not a per capita, but just a sheer volume, the opportunities in Texas and Florida are just massive. And I look forward to what happens over the next 10 years to really take advantage of that potential in the 75% of the country that doesn't have significant solar installed today.
Well, on those positive notes, we'll end today's webinar. I want to thank both Larry and Rob for their good presentations and also for their work on producing two valuable reports. Folks can find the slides and the recordings up on our website in several days, and we'll be back with more webinars in the future. So thank you all very much. Bye now.
Thank you.